The Book of Daniel, a surprising perspective that will shock you. What if I told you the real shock hidden in Daniel isn't a secret timetable to the end of the world, nor merely a catalogue of miracles to tally and admire? What if the surprise is far deeper and far more practical than puzzles about kings and dates? Picture a courtroom, not made of marble and law books, but of light and thunder, where the verdicts that shape kingdoms are debated in heaven long before armies march below. That is the perspective I want you carrying with you as we walk through Daniel, the startling revelation that history's driving force is not first and foremost politics or military power, but a divine throne room where prayer, angelic struggle, and faithful endurance decide the fate of empires. Let's begin where the book itself begins, with a forced march, a theft that felt endless to a people who suddenly found themselves strangers in a strange land. In 605 BC, Babylon's banners went up over Jerusalem. Young men were chosen, not for honor so much as utility, to be remade for service in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Among them was a teenager named Daniel. He and 3 companions were taken from their homes, stripped of their names, given new ones fit for Babylon's registers. Their past identities abbreviated, their futures seemingly co-opted by an imperial machine. This is exile in concentrated form. Dislocation, identity pressure, the temptation to compromise. But from the first moments, Daniel's story refuses to be a passive tale of cultural absorption. He exercises a quiet stubbornness that will mark his entire life. When offered the king's food tied to the cult and table of the empire, Daniel refuses. Not because he's being awkwardly pious, not because he wants to stand out, but because he understands that small loyalties build the character needed for larger moments. He asks for water and vegetables for 10 days as a test, and God honors that faithfulness. The scene is simple: 10 days, a humble diet, a practice of refusal, yet it is decisive. The point is not the menu, the point is the discipline. Moral courage often looks like a tiny resistance, repeated over time. Here is the first quiet lesson. Faithfulness in small things invites divine favor in big things. God's sovereignty does not erase human responsibility, rather, it honors it. Daniel is entrusted with discernment, wisdom, and steady nerve because he practiced being faithful when no one was watching. It's that steady nerve that will be necessary when a king wakes from a dream that will not leave him in peace. Nebuchadnezzar's nightmare feels like a cinematic image, an enormous statue, head of dazzling gold, chest of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron and feet part iron, part clay, shattering under a stone that no human hand smites. The spectacle is meant to terrorize. It is a vision of empires rising and falling, of human glory reduced to dust. But the drama is deeper than a political forecast. The king demands not just interpretation, he demands the secret, and he threatens life itself if the secret cannot be told. This is a moment when earthly power flexes its muscles, kingly pride pressing men into confessors of its superiority. Daniel, who could have stayed silent, who could have made peace with anonymous scholarship, kneels and prays. He doesn't use political cunning to flatter the monarch. He asks God for revelation. Notice the pattern. The clash is rarely decided by human shrewdness alone. God reveals mysteries to those who seek him. Political power rages, but the decisive knowledge comes from the throne room of heaven. Daniel's answer unmasks the arrogance of the king. Empires will pass, and only God's kingdom endures. The interpretation humbles the king and astonishingly elevates Daniel. He is given position in the court, not because he sought influence, but because the sovereign God appointed him as a witness. From here, narrative set pieces cascade. The fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar's madness, the handwriting on the wall, the lion's den. Each scene is a miniature courtroom drama with cosmic echoes. Consider the furnace episode. 3 young men refuse to bow to an image. The king, in rage and spectacle, throws them into a blazing pit that refused to burn, in the most literal sense. A fourth figure appears with them in the flames, and they emerge unscorched. This is not an applause line for showy deliverance. It is a theological argument made dramatic. Worship belongs to God alone. Idolatry is lawlessness. God accompanies his people in the trial, even when the trial is engineered as a public spectacle. The furnace is a theatrical rebuttal to empire's claim that it can define reality. Nebuchadnezzar himself becomes the case study of pride. He demands tribute. He declares his building projects. And he forgets the one whose hand guides the rise and fall of nations. Pride hardens into delusion. The king is driven from human company to live like an animal. Wild hair, grass for food, a mind dulled. Yet here is the mercy of the book. It is not merely retributive theatre. The same merciful God who humbles also restores when the humbled heart confesses. Nebuchadnezzar is not dragged into oblivion. He is brought through a radical repentance and worship of the Most High. Daniel does not celebrate the fall for its own sake. He uses it to expose the spiritual truth. Earthly power is provisional, and only the Ancient of Days is permanent. Then comes Belshazzar's feast, a scene that many remember for its vivid imagery. A drunken ruler praising idols and profaning sacred vessels taken from the Jerusalem temple until a hand appears and writes words on the wall. The handwriting, interpreted by Daniel, declares judgment. The point here is sharp: sacrilege and contempt for the holy invite public reckoning. Proud, sacrilegious revelry sits on the throne for a night. By morning, the empire is in new hands. Judgment is not arbitrary. It is the logical consequence when power divorces itself from reverence. Through all of these public reversals, Daniel's life unfolds with a steady rhythm. Prayer, revelation, witness, temptation, fidelity, vindication. He is promoted, envied, trapped and tried, but his prayer life continues like a heartbeat beneath the narrative. When political men plot against him, they exploit the very practices that define him. They pass laws to silence prayer, and then they gloat when legal machinery seems to win. But legal victories of human hands are subject to the court of heaven. Daniel's insistence on praying toward Jerusalem 3 times a day is not legalism. It is covenant identity in action. That brings us to one of the book's most cinematic and theologically charged episodes, the Lion's Den. A jealous coalition of officials tricks Darius into signing a law that will ensnare Daniel. The trap is elegant. Make the king sign a decree binding even his own hands. Then the conspirators gloat as Daniel, true to his practice, prays openly. The punishment seems final, thrown into a den with predators. But the narrative subverts expectation. The king weeps, seeks Daniel with tormented urgency, and the den refuses to harm the faithful man. The image is unforgettable: a night in a pit, a sleepless king pacing, a judge returning a verdict that only God could deliver. What feels like human justice backfires. The conspirators find themselves devoured by the very law they used as a weapon. Pause and see the pattern threading these dramatic vignettes. Each time the narrative could be read as a miracle checklist. God saves, God warns, God restores. But there is a more surprising, unifying perspective. Every episode points beyond the immediate event to a structural truth about reality. Daniel's stories insist that 2 arenas govern history: the visible political stage and the invisible spiritual court. The visible stage is dramatic and noisy. It is where kings sign decrees, generals march, and people celebrate. But beneath, the invisible courtroom is where petitions are made, angels carry messages, and verdicts that influence nations are considered. Prayer is the human link between these 2 courts. If you want a single thesis to carry from this part of the book into the prophetic sections that follow, let it be this: Daniel shows us that prayer is not merely private piety. Prayer is strategic engagement in a cosmic courtroom. That is the shock, because it relocates power. It says to those who have been taught that political maneuvering is the engine of history, stop and look up. There is a larger, decisive theatre. At this point you might say, but aren't these just stories of individual deliverances? How does that affect whole peoples? The answer is woven into the book itself. Daniel's personal fidelity and public vindication function as proof texts. They demonstrate God's rule over kings and remind exiles like you and me that identity and destiny are not erased by foreign masters. The prophetic and the pastoral meet here. These episodes function to form a people who can endure. They are teaching narratives, not merely historical footnotes. Before we move deeper, take a brief moment to consider how radical this would have sounded to an exiled community. You are dislocated. Your political structures are gone. Your temple is occupied or destroyed. Your future looks dim. Into this barrenness, Daniel's vignettes bring a different kind of assurance. God is still at work. The throne is still active. Worship and prayer mean something beyond the walls of the temple. The faithfulness of a few can witness to the whole nation's hope. The book, in its pastoral intent, says, "Be faithful." God will vindicate you in ways that matter for eternity, even when history humiliates you for a season. You might also wonder about the cost of this witness. Daniel and his friends risk everything by refusing to conform. That's intentional. The text wants the reader to feel the pressure, to see that faithfulness is costly. It's not that Daniel is a spiritual superhero immune to fear. He is a man who chooses trust when trust means possible death. This is the shape of biblical courage. It is regular, quotidian decisions made under duress. Now imagine the political arc continuing. Kings rise and fall, court intrigues multiply, and new rulers step into the theatre. One of those rulers, Darius, gets tangled in the jealous scheming of officials who weaponize law to crush a faithful servant. The lion's den scene presents both a human tragedy and a divine comedy. A plot meant to silence devotion exposes the moral bankruptcy of those who manipulate power against righteousness. When Darius realizes the trap, his regret is genuine. When Daniel is saved, the king is compelled to issue a proclamation honoring Daniel's God. The foreign ruler is forced to recognize the sovereignty of Israel's God. The reversal is theatrical. The enemy's cunning becomes their own downfall. The book does not hide the complexity. Political choices have consequences, but those consequences are nested within a divine order that preserves the faithful. This pattern, fidelity provokes danger and danger leads to vindication, teaches the exiles how to hold their ground. It also models for us today a posture toward power, courage without showiness, prayer as persistent petition, humility under possible humiliation. Daniel isn't a self-help manual for getting promoted in hostile environments. He is a theological case study in how God shapes worshippers to trust when the world pressures them into compromise. By now, you should be sensing the larger movement. The narrative episodes are not discrete amusements. They are the opening movements of a symphony that crescendos into visions. Daniel's personal story sets up the prophetic material that follows. The earlier narratives teach us who Daniel is, faithful, wise, disciplined, the man God will entrust with visions of cosmic scope. Because the vision material builds on the character material, we can't rush past the 10-day test, or the furnace, or the lions. They are formative. The surprising perspective keeps returning. Heaven's courtroom is active, and God's procedures include revelations to human witnesses and angelic agents who carry decisions into the visible world. When we finally approach the visions, those thunderous images of beasts and horns, the one like a son of man, and the Ancient of Days, remember that they do not function as a detached code. They are couched in a pastoral purpose, to shore up hope, to call for purity, and to frame suffering within a wider, redeeming plot. Many scholars read the beasts as symbols of successive empires, and that reading has strong historical purchase. Others interpret aspects of the imagery more symbolically or futuristically. Here is a caution we must hold tightly. There are competing, reasonable ways to map Daniel's symbolic language onto history or future events. No single mapping should be forced, as if it carries the weight of divine certainty. What carries that weight is the pastoral message that prophecy intends to form character and inspire endurance. We also cannot ignore the angelic activity that punctuates the visions. One of the most arresting episodes, the one that will later receive intense theological interest, is the angelic messenger who is delayed in answering Daniel's prayer for 21 days because he is engaged in a struggle with a prince of a foreign realm. Read plainly, this is staggering. Celestial beings are not passive notes in the why of the cosmos. They are actively engaged in blocking or speeding nations' agendas. Prayer, in Daniel's world, has tactical effects. It is not magical, it is relational and strategic. The revelation that prayers move battles in heaven will reshape how we think about intercession. Rather than being an add-on to politics, prayer is a frontline engagement in the unseen conflict that shapes history. This is the hinge of the surprising perspective. If prayer participates in cosmic struggle, then our petitions matter beyond our immediate circles. They are not mere confessions or comforts, they are operative. Again, a careful caveat. This should not make us spiritual triumphalists who think every crisis will be instantly corrected by prayer. The text is sober about suffering and delay. The angel did not instantly overturn the obstruction, but the message is clear. God is working, angels are active, and our prayers are intelligible participants in that work. There is an almost cinematic irony here. We instinctively imagine power as something visible, armies, palaces, laws. Daniel forces us to imagine power differently. The decisive moves often occur where human eyes can't see. Council in heaven, angels pushing against princes, the Ancient of Days opening books of judgment. Daniel's prophecies are less about giving a cheat code for political forecasting and more about opening the eyes of the faithful to the hidden mechanism of divine governance. That elevation of perspective is the moral and spiritual education Daniel offers. One more important note before we press forward: the prophetic sections include complex temporal language, 70 weeks, 2,300 evenings and mornings, and other markers. These numbers have generated centuries of debate. Some read them as symbolically compact, others as chronologies that point to historical fulfillments, and still others as layered prophecies with both near and far meanings. The right posture is humble interpretive confidence. We can affirm that the text speaks of God's timing and ultimate victory, while admitting that the precise mapping is contested. The pastoral thrust remains clear. God sets time, and the faithful are invited to trust his timetable amid uncertainty. At this junction, let me pause and invite you into the journey. If this deep dive into Daniel is helping you see the book not as a cryptic manual for decoding nations, but as a handbook for living under divine sovereignty, subscribe so you don't miss how the visions transform this perspective in the chapters ahead. We've reached a turning point. Up until now, we have watched Daniel's private fidelity intersect with public spectacle. We have seen God's sovereignty demonstrated in concrete rescues and humiliations of pride. The next movement moves from narrative into visions, thunderous, enigmatic, and laden with both immediate relevance and future hope. Daniel will be shown beasts that stalk the world and a figure like a son of man who approaches the Ancient of Days. Angels will explain mysteries, and a messenger delayed by spiritual opposition will reveal how close the cosmic court watches earthly events. But before the visions fully unfold, it's critical to remember the thread that holds them together: Daniel's life of prayer and purity. The visions will not be simple prophecies to be solved like puzzles. They are revelations given to a man whose character has been tried in fire and who has refused to bow. That is the pastoral logic. Prophecy is given to form people able to endure the trials it predicts. The visions will ask the exiles and us to hold fast in hope, to live faithfully, and to understand that history is moving toward God's just consummation. As the scene darkens and Daniel waits for revelation, a new drama begins, one that will pull the narrative into wider cosmic dimensions. Angels stride into view, beasts rise from the sea, the courtroom of heaven prepares to speak. And yet, even as cosmic images intensify, the personal stakes remain. How will the faithful live now, in the messy present, while those greater realities crystallize? Keep that question in your pocket. It frames everything that follows. As the vision begins, the sea itself becomes a stage. From its restless surface, 4 beasts heave upward, each monstrous, each stranger than the last, raw embodiments of power that will gnaw at history. The first is like a lion with wings of an eagle. It roars dominance and speed. The second, like a bear, lumbers forward, raised on one side as if favoring a stronger paw. The third resembles a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, swift, bifurcated, multiplying its cunning. Then comes the fourth, terrifying, dreadful beyond any creature Daniel had seen, iron teeth tearing, 10 horns on its head, and among those horns a little horn that plucks up 3 of the first horns by the roots and speaks great things. If you listen only for a map, the temptation is to pin these beasts to a neat row of historical empires: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Many scholars read them that way. It is a long-standing and persuasive tradition because the pattern fits the ancient sequences familiar to Daniel's first readers. But here is the careful caveat. The text is symbolic, shaped to make theological points about how power behaves, its speed, its brutality, its ambition, its fragmentation. One reading maps beasts to empires, another reads them as recurring archetypes of dominion that recur whenever humans crown themselves with pride. Hold both things in tension, historical purchase and symbolic depth. The vision wants us to understand patterns more than to hand us a contemporary dossier. On the shore of that symbolic sea, the courtroom of heaven assembles. Thrones are set, the Ancient of Days takes his seat. His clothing is white as snow, his hair like pure wool. His throne burns with fire, wheels blaze with flame. Rivers of fire flow, tens of thousands minister. The court opens and books are unrolled. The language is courtroom language. Judgment, record, verdict, and the scene is meant to make us dizzy with perspective. This is not a human courtroom bounded by walls and calendars. It is a cosmic tribunal whose procedures shape temporal fate. Then the counterpoint arrives. One like a son of man approaches the Ancient of Days, carried on clouds to the very throne, and receives a dominion that is everlasting. The passage is both startling and tender, not a beast, not an empire, but a human-like figure who receives a kingdom not taken by force but granted by the judge. Here the book announces its central hope. Whatever the beasts do and however terrifying their reigns, a different kind of rule will come. Humble, human, eternal. For the exiles in Babylon, this was not abstract consolation. It was the promise that God's ordering of the world will outlast every form of human domination. The vision of beasts does something crucial. It replaces the temptation to idolize empires with the discipline of perspective. The beasts command attention in the short term. The Ancient of Days sets the long term. The Son of Man secures the forever. Daniel is taught and teaches us that history's arc is not decided by the loudest roar, but by courtroom procedures of divine sovereignty. The visions do not stop at images of monsters and courts. They move into narrower, politically charged symbols. In chapter 8, Daniel sees a ram and a goat. The ram, with 2 horns, charges. The goat, with a conspicuous horn, rushes across the earth and tramples. The single horn breaks, and 4 emerge in its place, one of which becomes a contemptible horn that imposes desolations, challenges the sanctuary, and exalts itself against the Prince of Princes. If the beasts gave us structural insight, this ram and goat scene drills into particular geographies of conflict, prophetic sketches of power struggles, desecration, and the humiliation of earthly rulers. When Gabriel is sent, as he is in these chapters, he provides explanation, but not a blueprinted timetable that removes all mystery. He gives ratio and meaning, not a fully settled key. Gabriel says, in effect, "Here's the broad sweep, and here are particulars you need for endurance." The interpretation invites prudence. Where some readers want absolute certainties about every horn or number, the book rather presses us to posture ourselves, learn to wait, pray, and live in faithful anticipation without pretending to possess a tidy timeline. That brings us to perhaps the most electrifying theological detail of the visions, the angelic delay. Daniel prays, he seeks understanding, an angelic messenger speeds to give explanation, but is held up for 21 days by a spiritual opposition described as the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Michael, a chief prince, comes alongside, and the messenger is finally able to finish his journey to Daniel. Pause over this for a moment. The image is unapologetically cosmic in scale. There is an active, personal opposition in the unseen realm that can impede the course of revelation. Angels are depicted not as decorative backgrounds, but as actors engaged in struggle on behalf of nations. If we miss this, we miss the hinge. The angelic delay reframes prayer from private devotion to participatory warfare. Daniel's fasting and entreaty are not a spiritual hobby, they are operative interventions. Prayer opens windows. It asks the heavenly advocate to move. It elicits angelic response. But note the balance. This is not a magic formula. The messenger is delayed. Daniel's prayer does not produce an instant cosmic takeover. The text is sober about friction and delay. We learn to pray with patience, to intercede with perseverance, and to accept that deliverance sometimes comes after struggle and even after suffering. The angelic conflict motif carries an important pastoral implication. Our petitions are meaningful within a larger reality. If prayer is a voice in the courtroom, angels are ministers who can carry petitions and sometimes must wrestle for their passage. That theological shock, prayer as tactical participation in a cosmic struggle, transforms how we imagine intercession. It does not cheapen it, it dignifies it. Prayer matters because it engages the right court. The visions then pivot to time language that has confounded and fascinated readers for centuries: 70 weeks, 2,300 evenings and mornings, and later the 1,290 and 1,335 days, or days equivalents. These numbers have prompted entire traditions of interpretation, and they deserve careful, humble handling. One common reading casts 70 weeks, often understood as 77s of years, as a prophetic timeline culminating in an anointed prince and significant events such as an anointed one's coming, the cutting off of a leader, and the establishment of righteousness. This reading has historical traction and pastoral resonance because it frames the coming of God's anointed as within God's determined time. But other competent readings see weeks as symbolic units or as layers of fulfillment with both immediate and distant reference, near-century shocks for the original exile community and further telescoped fulfillments pointing forward. The sense here is not to resolve every scholarly debate, but to insist that the numbers communicate two certainties. God governs time, and God's timetable intersects with human suffering and hope. Whether 70 weeks counts in our calendar or serves as symbolic theological language, the point for the book is pastoral. God ordains a time for justice and restoration. Then there are the 2,300 evenings and mornings in chapter 8, a phrase whose rhythm suggests sacrifice cycles, evening and morning offerings, or days counted, depending on the reader. Some interpreters connect them with a period of profanation and purification. Others read them as symbolic of a prolonged trial. Similarly, the later mention of 1,290 and 1,235 in chapter 12 adds layers, markers that push patience and endurance to the forefront. The book repeatedly asks its audience to live with numbered hope. Yes, there is a limit to the oppression. Yes, there is a promised vindication. Yet the precise mapping can be elusive and debated. This interpretive humility matters profoundly. Daniel's numbers are not a secret cipher meant to produce certainty for fence-sitting speculation about modern elections or leaders. They are theological signposts that call for perseverance amid uncertainty. The proper posture is not triumphal certainty, but resolute expectation, praying, working, suffering, and hoping, while recognizing that ultimate timelines are in God's hands. All of this converges on perhaps the most arresting eschatological promise in the book, the promise of resurrection. Daniel 12 gives us a line that rings with finality and comfort. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:2. This is no marginal note. It is a seismic claim about the destiny of the faithful and the unrighteous. For a people rooted in covenant hope, the promise that death is not the final word turns exile's despair into expectant watchfulness. Resurrection here is both consolation and accountability, hope that justice will be set right, warning that choices have consequences. When we map this onto the rest of Scripture, we see continuity. Daniel's resurrection hope is taken up, clarified, and embodied in the New Testament witness to Christ's resurrection and the future raising of the dead. But caution again, Daniel stands on its own as a prophetic voice that insists on bodily vindication for God's people. This is not abstract immortality. It is a promise that the story of human beings ends with God's restorative justice. What about the little horn that grows and speaks proudly, trampling truth and resisting the holy? Interpret with restraint. In the text's immediate horizon, the little horn acts as a profane antagonist who defiles and persecutes. Historically, it has been mapped onto particular rulers who oppress the people. The important theological rhythm is constant. The little horn appears where power refuses limits and where sacrilege and blasphemy attempt to replace reverence. Daniel's consistent teaching, yield your worship to the Ancient of Days, not to the little horns that rise and fall. As these visions conclude, the angelic messenger leaves Daniel with a final charge. Seal the book until the time of the end. Seal it not because the book will be useless, but because prophecy functions in two ways: immediate clarity for present trials and sealed revelation that will be progressively disclosed. This sealing invites patient study, prayerful interpretation, and communal discernment. It says, live in faith now, study the visions. Do not force their final meaning into the present, especially when doing so fosters pride or fear. Now step back and see the larger architecture. The narrative episodes, 10-day test, furnace, handwriting, lion's den, formed a character. Those formative moments made Daniel a faithful seer, capable of interpreting dreams and visions because he had practiced fidelity in ordinary life. The visions, in turn, are not a detached hobby. They are tools designed to form a people who can endure exile and persecution. That pastoral intent is the real shock we've been tracking. Daniel's prophetic material is not merely a divinatory device. It is a formative instrument. It disciplines hope, sharpens prayer, and trains endurance. That leads to the heart of the surprising perspective promised at the outset. The decisive stage for history is not ultimately the earthly palace or the war tent, but the heavenly courtroom. Emphasis: this is not an abstract metaphysical claim that denies earthly processes. It is a reframing. Visible politics matters, armies and laws change human life. But those visible actions are embedded within and influenced by an unseen deliberative sphere in which God sits, angels argue, and justice is pronounced. Prayer is the interface between the human courtroom and the heavenly tribunal. To pray, in Daniel's world, is to carry petitions to the bench where verdicts are weighed. That reframing has profound consequences for Christian praxis. First, it dignifies prayer as strategy. Prayer is not merely devotional punctuation in the day, it's an engagement in the argument over history's outcomes. Second, it cautions us against substituting political idolatry for faithful prayer. If heaven remains the decisive stage, then our primary vocation remains worship and petition, not the absolute trust in partisan power. Third, it shapes our perseverance. We live as if both courts matter, work in the visible, pray to the unseen. All of this must be tethered to humility. Daniel's visions do not license arrogance about decoding every future event. They invite patience, disciplined study, and communal discernment. Interpretive certainty should yield to interpretive caution. When ambitious readers insist on transposing Daniel's symbols onto specific contemporary actors without qualification, they violate the book's pastoral intent. The prophetic call is to formation, not to spectacle. Let's make this concrete. How does one live as if Daniel's courtroom thesis is true? First, adopt a rhythm of prayer that is regular and public where necessary, private where needed. Daniel prayed 3 times a day facing Jerusalem, not because ritual made him righteous, but because prayer shaped identity. Reconfigure your agenda so that worship and petition inform your public and private choices. Second, cultivate humility about political knowledge. Engage in civic life, yes, but don't render it absolute. Political action and prayer are partners, not rivals. Third, prepare for suffering without despair. Daniel's prophecies prepare exiles to hope amid persecution. They never promise an easy life for the faithful. Expect resistance, but hold to promised vindication. Fourth, train your imagination in eschatological hope. The Son of Man, coming before the Ancient of Days, gives shape to a hope that will outlast empires and personal losses. We also need to attend to spiritual warfare practice without sensationalism. The angelic struggles demand sober acknowledgement that spiritual realities exist and matter, but they do not recommend either paranoia or triumphalism. The proper responses are disciplined intercession, collective prayer, scripture-shaped discernment, and moral courage. When we pray, we do not manipulate angels like spiritual mailmen. We appeal to the judge, and angels participate as ministers of divine will. And finally, posture your life around the resurrection promise. Daniel's assurance that many will awake to everlasting life makes the present sufferings survivable. When your life feels like exile, when your home is estranged, your work marginalized, your family fractured, the book tells you that this is not the final frame. There is an enduring court and a coming vindication. Before we close, let us pull once more on the thread that will knot the whole tapestry. The surprising perspective, the shock the title promises, is not a trick of chronology, nor a sensational decoding of contemporary politics. It is this: Daniel invites us to see the world as a courtroom, where crowns are set aside before the bar, and where one like a son of man receives an everlasting kingdom. The real engine of history is not purely steel and strategy. It is the divine adjudication that orders the cosmos. Prayer is how we file petitions in that judicial theatre. Prophecy is how God trains his people to live under that adjudication with patience, holiness, and hope. If you allow that to settle in your bones, it changes everything. It changes prayer from a private exercise of comfort into a tactical engagement with God's purposes. It changes how you measure success, not by immediate political wins, but by fidelity under pressure. It changes your view of suffering, not senseless loss, but the theater in which God refines endurance. It changes your imagination of power, not the loudest horn, but the Ancient of Days verdict. There is an irony here that I do not want you to miss. Daniel himself never sought throne or fame. He sought clarity and faithfulness. Yet by being faithful, he became the conduit through which God taught a scattered people how to endure until the everlasting kingdom. The book's final pedagogy is simple and radical. Be faithful now, pray continually, interpret cautiously, hope surely. So what do we do with the visions that remain sealed, the times we cannot map, and the enemies we cannot name? We pray, we work, we resist pride, we practice small acts of fidelity that build spiritual muscle. We insist on worship that acknowledges the Ancient of Days, not a present empire. And now one last word of pastoral encouragement. When you see the smoke of empire rise, when you face the furnace, when the den yawns beneath you, remember the courtroom. Recall the Ancient of Days' white robes, the books rolled open, the Son of Man approaching on the clouds. These are not fantasy escapes. They are the theological anchors Daniel offers exiles and heirs alike. The ancient scenes become contemporary fuel. They teach us how to live with courage, how to pray with persistence, how to hope with endurance. Which of these revelations surprised you most? The image of the heavenly courtroom, the angel delayed by spiritual resistance, the Son of Man given everlasting dominion, or the promise that many will awake to everlasting life? Tell me in the comments which moment shifted your view of power and why.